Thank you for staying with us. This is the afternoon edition of Newsfeed. Now, Jeff Schultz, a senior economist at global bank BNP Paribas South Africa, predicts another tumultuous year for the local economy. Speaking at a BNP Paribas quarterly economic update event at Melrose Arch earlier today, Schultz cited the continued electricity outages as the main reason behind the seemingly pessimistic view. He joins us now in the studio. A very good evening to you, Jeff.
Good evening.
Well, Eskom is a bit of an obvious one to focus on right now with the load shedding that's taking place intermittently in the country. But if you could put this into perspective for us, what is the actual effect of the load shedding on South Africa's economy?
Well, I think the effect is broad-based, right? It affects industry, it affects households, it affects retail, mining. And so, unfortunately, our estimate is kind of that a stage 2 load shedding for one day costs this economy in the order of R1 billion a day. And so, this is unfortunately a very severe structural economic difficulty, but unfortunately probably a necessary evil right now, because Eskom needs to get a handle on its maintenance backlogs at its aging power stations, something which hasn't unfortunately happened over the past decade.
This does not seem to be a problem that is going to be going away anytime soon, the Eskom problem that is, while we're still in the process of trying to find a mixed bag of energy and a mixed energy mix. What are the type of solutions that could circumvent this R1 billion loss? How do you plug that hole?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Eskom management has made very clear that load shedding is one inevitable and necessary over the next 18 months, in fact. So how do we curb that? Well, I think it's legislative changes that I think can be made by the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy regarding self-generation, small-scale embedded generation, allowing mining companies, manufacturing houses to be able to produce their own electricity in order to stabilize, I guess, their own production dynamics. And I think that will obviously filter through, hopefully, into the household sector and the broader business community. So I think those are the types of things that we're hoping over the next 6 months will start to gain a lot of traction, because, again, these things take time to implement. It's not as if you change the legislation today and tomorrow everyone's offline or off the grid. These things have a lag of about 6 to 9 months at least.
And what impact has the state of our volatile state-owned enterprises had on the economy? There's SAA on the line. We're looking at Eskom that we've been talking about with power as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously Eskom is probably the key to the economy right now, because without stable power supply means that we have an unstable economy. But of course, other state-owned companies, South African Airways, obviously being one of them as well. There's job losses at stake here. It has severe implications for the economy, and I think more importantly as well, I think also for the fiscal dynamics of the economy. So we've seen a significant deterioration in our fiscal picture over the last 3 or 4 years, and unfortunately that has led to multiple credit ratings downgrades out of rating agencies, and the potential later this year for Moody's to join the sub-investment grade band.
So talking about Moody's and the potential downgrade, you think we're closer to that than we've ever been before?
Where we stand today, if you're talking about growth of 0.5% this year, which is our forecast, if you're talking about a fiscal deficit nearly 7% of GDP and debt ratios hitting 70%, outside of us getting meaningful policy initiatives to really move the needle on growth, be it in the energy sector, be it in broader state-owned companies, or in other elements of policy like mining policy, if we don't see movement on those structural growth difficulties, then unfortunately I think we probably are on a one-way train to a downgrade from Moody's.
And should that downgrade become a reality, then South Africa out of the FTSE World Government Bond Index, what repercussions does that actually have materially on the economy?
Well, I think certainly from a sentiment and business confidence point of view, it can have very severe implications. Our banking industry, for instance, their own credit rating is tied to that of the sovereign. And so if the government's credit rating is downgraded by Moody's, so are the banks. And so that increases their funding costs. And so it has quite broad-based implications. What I will say, though, is that if you look at financial asset prices in South Africa, the currency, particularly the bond market, a lot of this is very well well discounted, we would argue. And so it's not necessarily to say that because Moody's could potentially downgrade us that we're going to see a massive blowout in bond yields or a massive blowout in the currency. But certainly I think we shouldn't take this lightly. A downgrade is not good for any economy, and certainly not good for the economy that we see today in South Africa.
Would a downgrade be enough for corporate disinvestment?
Well, I think you've really seen a fair amount of that over the last 5 years in anticipation that we could be on a one-way train to sub-investment grade across all the credit rating agencies. We haven't really seen meaningful gross domestic fixed investment in this economy. In fact, we've seen negative growth rates in most areas. And so I think from that perspective, it's very important. And I think with confidence comes investment. And really, how ultimately we're going to get ourselves out of the mess that we're in is really by stimulating confidence, and you get that by getting the right policy mix in place. And unfortunately, so far, we've yet to see significant moves to get that right. However, we are confident that over the next 6 to 12 months, there probably will be some necessary adjustment here.
Policy, regulations and adjustments. Another issue that was spoken about were possible corruption prosecutions and the effect that those would have on the economy. Are you really betting on that?
I think, we think that corruption prosecutions are likely to happen, but the wheels of justice do generally turn quite slowly, as we've seen. And I think it's really important as well that to understand the context of the National Prosecuting Authority, the new head, she's building a new leadership behind, a new team behind her. And I think these things take a bit of time, but ultimately I think that this prosecuting authority wants to ensure that whatever case that gets brought to the courts is watertight, so that we can bring those people responsible for malfeasance in the state to book.
You also mentioned in the report that you were quite surprised by the rate cut. It came sooner than expected, but that you are actually looking forward to another possible rate cut. What is that based on?
Yeah, we'd started the year anticipating that the Reserve Bank was going to be in a position to ease policy rates twice this year, and 25 basis point rate reductions. It came a little bit earlier than we anticipated in January. I think really the premise behind that is the low growth environment that I've just described, as well as particularly a very benign domestic inflation environment. So our forecast for inflation both this year and next is actually around the midpoint, if not even below the midpoint of the South African Reserve Bank's 3 to 6% inflation target range. So we're talking about 4.5% or even lower in CPI inflation that we're anticipating over the next 2 years. And we think that, coupled with South Africa running a negative output gap, very low levels of growth in the economy, is likely to allow the South African Central Bank to at least ease policy rates modestly. Why we don't think more than that at this stage is because there's an element of fiscal dominance in the way that the SARB is thinking about monetary policy decisions right now, and that unfortunately comes down to the fiscal picture that we face right now, with rising debt ratios, prospect for credit ratings downgrades, all of which require that we keep a relatively healthy country risk premium attached to South Africa, so that we can continue to attract investment.
The country is looking forward to the State of the Nation address that will be delivered shortly. What is it that we ought to be expecting from that that could possibly bolster the confidence that you are talking about, the confidence that's needed to keep and perhaps even increase investment?
I think we'd like to see more concrete timelines on when policies are going to be wrapped up. The Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Amendment Bill, the Mining Charter, telecommunications spectrum allocation, land expropriation without compensation, the energy sector in particular. I think there needs to be a strong focus on that in the SONA. How are we going to stabilize the grid, through these legislative changes that I mentioned earlier? I think all of these have to be at the forefront of the President's speech this week, because really that's going to be this all comes down to how to get the economy growing again. And if we don't have growth, we don't have investment, we don't have employment, and ultimately that's what this is all about. And so we are looking for more clarity and more decisiveness, particularly on those policy areas.
And when the time comes to look at the budget for the country, where do you predict that allocations will be? Where should allocations actually go?
Look, I think we have a budget that is very fair in the sense that a lot of socio-economic programs, education, healthcare, security, all get significant budgets, as does health. I think we need to improve the efficiencies with which we spend state funds. An area, though, that we think that there's room for us to tighten our belt significantly on the budget is on the public sector wage bill. This currently eats up about 35% of total government expenditure right now, and unfortunately it's crowding out a lot of the other pressing expenditure issues in the economy. And so we would like to see out of this budget is an acknowledgement that we need to rein in this public sector wage bill, be it through wage freezes for top earners in the public service, and I think a very strict guideline to the labour unions that strictly inflation-linked increases going forward have to be the status quo going forward. We can no longer accept real increases in wage growth in this economy right now, given the extent or the gravity of our fiscal deterioration that we've seen in recent years.
That's a bit of a catch-22 situation, because with that, a freeze in the increase in the wage bill, you do have the lowest earning end of the market, the unions wanting increases and therefore going on strikes, and that then affecting, obviously, the productivity. How do you mitigate that then?
So I think, again, we're not proposing necessarily that for the bulk of your unionized workers in the country that they should get a wage freeze. I don't think that's really feasible at this point in time, given where the economy is. But we are saying that for those earners that are earning between 1.5 and 1.5 million rand a year and up, a freeze in wages, a scrapping of bonuses at least for 2020 should be on the cards. Limits to pay progression policies, tweaks to ministerial perks, and those types of things, that can send a very strong signal further down the line when the next 3-year wage agreement gets entered into with the labour unions, that we should expect inflation-linked increases and not inflation plus 2 or 3%, which has been the norm up to now. That, we think, is probably a more feasible solution to curbing the wage bill over time, rather than ultimately hurting everyone at this point in time.
And what have been the effects on strikes on the economy? Is that something that you looked at within this quarterly report?
Well, strikes have been a common feature of South Africa's economy over the last couple of years, but what we will say is that the longevity of strikes in this economy has been far less in the last 2 or 3 years. When you have an unemployment rate of 29.2% and really a very significant degree of lack of hiring in this economy, I think wage moderation, particularly in the private sector, has started to come to the fore. So if you look at nominal wage growth in the first 3 quarters of last year, it was around 4%, so really, really low in comparison to sort of the 8% that we've enjoyed, 10 years, for the past 10 years. So I think already that adjustment has started to take place in the private sector. We now need to see it in the public sector as well.
But your summation for the economy this year is that we ought to be bracing ourselves for a bit of a downturn.
Absolutely. I think the finance minister put it very well. We need to be tightening our belts. Everyone needs to share in a little bit of the pain. On the plus side, we don't think that there is necessarily scope for big tax increases in this budget. We think the adjustment needs to come from the expenditure side rather than on the revenue side.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much. You are the bearer of not very good news this afternoon. But we, as you say, will tighten our belts and remain optimistic. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. That's Jeff Schultz, the senior economist at a global bank, BNP Paribas, South Africa.